You've probably seen this story. In 1894, the Times of London warned that within 50 years, every street in the city would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure. 4 years later, the world's first urban planning conference gathered in New York City. They were supposed to meet for 10 days. They quit after 3, defeated by horses. Almost none of that is true the way you heard it. So today we're going to do 2 things. First, separate the small piece of this story that is real from the much larger piece that was invented. And then, the part that matters, we're going to look at the long shadow this myth casts on a decision we're making right now, in 2026, about how we expect 2050 to fix itself. Because the wrong version of this story is quietly rewriting climate policy, energy strategy, and how we deal with AI. Let's start with what was real. In the 1890s, large American cities ran on horses. New York alone had somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 of them, pulling streetcars, hauling goods, carrying people. Eric Morris, writing in Access magazine in 2007, documents the unglamorous arithmetic. Each horse produced 15 to 30 pounds of manure a day, plus roughly a quart of urine. Multiply that out, and a city the size of New York was processing thousands of tons of waste every 24 hours on streets, against curbs, and stables next to apartment buildings. It was, by every account, a public health emergency. Manure piles hatched billions of flies a year. Diseases spread. Dead horses, and 15,000 of them died on New York streets every year, were sometimes left for days. So the underlying crisis was genuine. In 1898, Mayor George E. Waring Jr., a serious sanitation reformer, convened what's now remembered as the world's first international urban planning conference in New York. Delegates came from Europe and across the United States. Manure, sanitation, traffic, and stables were all on the agenda. And here's where the myth begins. The most quoted detail in this entire story: the Times of London declaring in 1894 that 9 feet of manure would bury the city by 1944 or 1950, appears to be a fabrication. The phrase has been traced back to a 2004 article by Stephen Davies. The Times itself, asked to find the original, searched its archive, and in 2018 publicly stated that no such article exists. What does exist in the Times in June 1894 is a much more boring exchange of letters complaining about dust and mud, including one from Lord Randolph Churchill. Yes, Winston's father, arguing the situation was, quote, not incurable. The other famous detail, that the 1898 conference broke up in despair after 3 days, defeated by horses, is also unsupported. The conference happened. The agenda was real. But the dramatic collapse appears to be a later embellishment, repeated until it felt like fact. So strip the legend away, and what's left? A real, slow, dirty, dangerous problem. No prophetic newspaper quote. No defeated experts walking out of conference. Just a city full of animals with people working through what to do for decades, not days. And then, gradually, the automobile happened. By the early 1920s, urban horses were largely gone. The myth says technology saved us. The record says technology was one of several things, and most of the work was policy and time. Why does the false version stick so well? Because it tells a comforting story. It says when a city hits the wall, the experts give up, and then a new technology almost magically arrives just in time. You don't have a plan. You don't have to coordinate. You don't have to legislate. You just have to wait. The real history is the opposite. Cities banned horses from certain streets. They built sewers. They taxed stables. They subsidized electric streetcars before automobiles dominated. Henry Ford's Model T arrived in 1908, but the actual collapse of urban horsepower took 20-plus years of overlapping policy and slow infrastructure rebuild. The internal combustion engine got the credit. The boring decisions in city halls across 2 decades did most of the work. The myth conveniently deletes those 2 decades. It conveniently deletes the ban on stables in residential blocks. It conveniently deletes the public health departments fighting for cleaner streets. It collapses 20 years of human effort into one heroic technological moment. We don't know exactly when the false Times of London quote first appeared, but we know it spread because it was useful to people who wanted to argue that cities don't need to plan because the future will arrive on its own. Now look around. We tell almost the same story to ourselves about electric vehicles, about artificial intelligence, about carbon. The narrative goes, the market will solve it, the technology will arrive, and the smart move is to do nothing and wait. It is almost word for word the imaginary 1894 Times of London quote in modern dress. 9 feet of manure becomes 50 centimeters of sea rise. The conference disbanding in 3 days becomes a climate summit that ends without an agreement. The hero is always a future technology that hasn't shipped yet. The actual history of how cities solve the horse problem is the opposite of that story. It was sustained policy. It was zoning. It was public health regulators with quiet budgets and decades of authority. It was, and this is uncomfortable, slow. The technology mattered, but only because the political plumbing was already in place when it arrived. We are running the same play right now with electric cars. Tesla's first mass-market sedan came out in 2012. Charging networks are still patchy in 2026. Grid upgrades are taking longer than the cars. The infrastructure problem is just like in 1898, not the engine. It's the everything else. By 2050, the version of this story we believe today will decide how livable cities are. If we repeat the myth and let the future arrive on its own, we may end up with the climate equivalent of 15,000 dead horses in the street. If we tell ourselves the real version, by 2050 our cities may look unrecognizable by deliberate design, with a boring infrastructure done first, and the headline technology arriving on top of it. The long shadow of 1894 isn't horse manure. It's a story we keep telling ourselves about how change happens, a story that turns out to be wrong in the specific ways that matter most. The cities that solved the horse problem did the unglamorous work first. We can do that, too, or we can keep waiting for a Times of London article that was never written. If long shadow stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. There's another one Friday.